Welcome everyone again. Thanks for coming here at Paris API. Who is there for the first time? Cool. Okay, half, in my opinion. Well, welcome. Welcome for the first timers. So just to intro some stuff, we have changed our format for now a couple of months, so we're not doing classical talks where there is slides and people talking, which usually other meetup does. But we're doing something more of what you're gonna see now, which is more of a open discussion about a subject. We have done a lot of other subjects, but today is gonna be about API dev tools. So so we have a couple of questions that we have been preparing. Today is gonna be about developers tools, development tool of APIs. So about the development life cycle, what are the tools that you need to know and that you probably don't know today. So here we are. First of all, I'll let you introduce our two new guests. So first, Pierre, let's go. You can go directly.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so hi, I'm Pierre, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Strapi, which is an open source headless CMS.
So my name is Misha, and I'm the founder and well CEO of a little company called POW. And what we're making is a HTTP client as well as an API documentation and development tool called POW, and it's has a strong focus on UX, and it's only on macOS.
Okay, cool. No, I want you can keep sharing this one with you too. So yes, so today we're gonna play kind of a little game where we're gonna put ourselves in a position where let's say we're gonna build a new API and we are thinking of what are the different questions we need to ask ourselves. You know, sometimes we are in a big company and things are already here and I would say just need to follow the rules, but at least we need to follow the rules. But what if we are building something from scratch, right? What if we have some kind of constraints and we would like to go on with something new? What are the questions we need to ask ourselves? So let's first begin. Okay, it's my laptop. I'll put it again. Let's first begin on with the preparation. So before building the API, you need to obviously prepare for it. So what are the main guidelines or I would say design you think we should at least think of follow in the beginning?
So at the beginning, the most important thing is to really list the things that are very specific to your project. So what is the purpose of your API? Will it be public or private? What is the existing API architecture in your company? And a very important thing is who is in your team, because it can change a lot of things if you have to select programming language and all your developers are Ruby developers and you want to develop the API on Node.js, you really need to make sure it is a good move, because it can be very a real problem in the company if the stack is not the one which was in the company before.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's very true. You obviously won't be doing, I don't think, GraphQL if you have a company like based on old frameworks, obviously. What I would say maybe as a blanket guideline, try to use things that are not too outdated, obviously. So probably today I would say pick between a REST API or REST-like API or GraphQL API, but also don't be too much on following the trends and try to know what you actually want and Like, don't do GraphQL just because it's trending, because Facebook says you have to do that. You actually have the choice, and there is nothing wrong doing a REST API if it's well made in 2019. There is no point just being on the bleeding edge just for the sake of it. And I think to choose really what kind of architecture, because we are not talking only about the language here, but more of the architecture you want. And for that, I think you need to think about the properties of your API. Not only what your customer will be, but what you want from your API. Is it, does it need to scale? Does it need to be versioned? Do you want to plan in time? Like, do you want your API to last for 10 years, and then you need to think about versioning V1, V2, and being able to quickly iterate and modify your API? Do you need your API to be quickly discoverable by other people? Do you want to be as standardized as possible so you can reach a larger audience, or do you want to be very narrow? I think we're talking here about more of an internal API at first, so you may not have these constraints, but if you are thinking on the longer run, you may have these. So I think that's where you'll be able to make the choice between maybe REST and GraphQL. For example, REST would be much more easily scalable, because you can have very easy caching strategies on REST. Caching is built inside of REST because it's just closer to HTTP. You'll have much harder time to cache GraphQL APIs. But on the other side, if you want to quickly iterate and not have an easier versioning, maybe GraphQL will be. So just an idea. Think about the needs of your API before choosing the architecture itself.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for these answers. I would like to ask something to Pierre, because you made Strapi. Talk to me about Strapi a little bit. At which time and what? I mean, when did your company and your tool will come? Is it gonna be after this thinking that we did, or is it gonna be after? Like, is that solution? What is the right time for your solution?
So we are a specific kind of tool for APIs, because we are a CMS, so Strapi is useful for content APIs. So basically, until now, traditional CMSs are two parts. So the backend to manage the content, and the frontend to create HTML pages to display these pages in browsers. And now we have more and more devices. The content has to be displayed on mobile applications, TV, and other kind of things. But a mobile application, for example, cannot understand HTML pages. So we decided to remove the front-end part of the CMS and to replace it with an API. So Strapi is really useful if you need to manage content and to display it anywhere. So it can be a website, but built with React, Vue.js, etc., or a mobile application or anything else. And you can also build a product and prototype very, very quickly. So you won't build Facebook with Strapi, I totally agree. But if you want to manage content or to very quickly prototype a production-ready API, it can save you a lot of time.
Okay. Do you guys know other bootstrapping tools that are on the market? Probably your competitors, but that are probably other headless CMSs or just tools that are letting us bootstrap quickly APIs?
Yeah, so I wouldn't consider other headless CMSs as tools to bootstrap APIs, because most of them are online, so you cannot customize the API, so you won't build a real API with them. And for other alternatives, you have two kinds of solutions. So the online solution, so you can use, for example, Google Firebase or AWS AppSync to easily bootstrap your API. But then it's still totally online. So if you prefer to keep control on your code, on your data, on everything, it's much better to use an open source solution. So there are obviously a lot of frameworks to build APIs. So you can have the very minimalistic approach with a framework like Express or Koa if you are using Node.js, or maybe something bigger like Sails or Meteor, or it saves a lot of time, but it can be bigger in your stack. So again, it really depends on the project you want to build, but there are quite a lot of options.
Do you want to add something, or?
Yeah, maybe. I think I'll just follow up with your last answer about the frameworks. I think maybe that will sound a bit old-fashioned compared to Strapi or things like that, but at least in my experience, it's been always quite easy to build an API on top of an existing web framework. I have an experience with Django, and it has, for example, Django REST framework, and it's just a thin layer that automatically will generate a nice API with all like fetching, creation, listing, deletion of objects just on top of your existing data model. So you probably have experiences as, for those of you who are backend developers, you already model your data, and in many cases with REST APIs, you will have a very high coupling between the API resources, the different URLs you will have in your REST APIs, and the database models. So it's not like a general rule, but it has a chance to be quite easy to map that together.
All right. Let's talk a little bit now about API clients, and probably a question for you. Can you tell me first of all about like what is Paul and what it does, and why did you came up with it?
Well, I think we may have a bit of the same background for it. I think we both built a product that we badly needed in our previous experiences, like hurtful experiences before, yes. Maybe. And yeah, to me, the idea came when I was an iOS developer, actually a student, an intern, and the guys building the backend were always giving us a pretty poor documentation or no documentation at all, and there was this horrible back and forth between us as the front-end team on the iOS app and the guys building a quick and dirty API. And I was always either using curl or command line tools to test the APIs, or even worse, actually using my own code as the testing for the API. Like just let's build the app, see if it works. Oh, it doesn't work. Okay, let's iterate again. It was quite horrible. So I badly wanted a UI where I can quickly enter all the infos, see how it goes, and later I realized that building my own little side projects, I realized that I needed that also to build the API in the backend. You write your backend code, whatever language you are using, PHP, Python, Ruby, or Node. You need to be able to quickly test that. So POW is definitely that. You can see that as a beautiful UI for curl, for example. So it was the original idea, and over time, I wanted it to be more interactive. And the idea was you may have a custom authentication scheme, and you need to calculate the MD5 or the SHA-1 of some resources, or have let's say pick one value from the JSON response of one request, and then use it again in the next one, like this kind of chaining. So it has all these features for testing. Yeah, did I answer your question?
Yeah. And can you, because I've been always curious about that, can you tell me why is it only for Mac?
Did I mention I was an iOS developer before?
Yeah, okay.
So you can see some part of the... I think macOS has been always in the DNA of POW. It was both an API tool and a Mac app since the early days. And actually, I think with time, I don't regret that choice because it allowed me to be both in both communities, both in the native apps community and in the API one. So it has kind of this bridge together, but also it allows POW to have a nicer UX, I think, be able to be more tightly coupled with the OS and have all these features, also more performant for loading large responses or regarding the memory usage.
Okay. Okay. In general, what do you think more than just being a curl with a GUI API client should have, like as features?
Okay.
As you like, you can.
You can go. You are the experts.
You can give your need and I will give you that.
Yes, exactly. So just basic needs. You put a URL, a verb, some parameters, and you test your request. So this is the most basic thing. But there are also many other features, such as the ability to add cookies or a token for authorization, and to save your request to use it later. So yeah, I think you can talk better than me about that, but there are my ideas.
Maybe I can answer you with another question, if you don't mind. You are now a little team at your company.
Yeah.
So how do you share these request configurations you may have in such an API client?
So we use Postman, so we have some collections that we share together, and Strapi also support GraphQL. So we use a lot. Before we used GraphQL, and now we are using Playground. So that's pretty much it. And we don't share that much GraphQL queries, but we write tests. And that's our way to make sure everything is working correctly.
Thanks. Yeah, so the reason why I asked the question is I think teams actually need to be able to share these request configurations. When you are actually building an API that gets larger and larger, you don't want everyone to invest time to build that, so you need that kind of sharing of the configuration. And in fact, at POW we have some quite large customers, large teams. I can mention Airbnb and Tinder. They have like about 100 engineers working on their APIs, and they're using POW for that. And one feature we introduced 2 years ago was team syncing. And the idea is that one person, you can collaborate together on building your API configuration and be able to sync it with other people. So I can totally see a typical team where the backend guys are building the API, configuring everything. And so then the product managers can validate that everything is working well, and then on the other side of the spectrum you have the client team test the API on the client, whatever it is, POW or Postman, and then be able to implement that. And because clients like this can generate quick snippets of code for the client, it can be convenient to just copy paste that from the client and then on your own code.
Is there anyone who is using an API client which is not POW or not Postman? Which one?
Yeah.
Sonia? And you? Swagger? Yeah, it does a little
So
bit.
the Swagger UI.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, because as others and for GraphQL, talk to me about how do you use an API client for GraphQL?
So we have Playground, but we don't use it that much because by default APIs generated by Strapi are REST APIs. So we have a plugin which actually transforms this API into a GraphQL API. So we at Strapi don't use GraphQL that much, but our users use a lot. So I cannot really answer this.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
One question.
Yeah. Go for it.
Just a question for POW. POW is only for Mac as a stack.
I know this sucks. But I fully understand, and by the way, thanks for the kind words about Power. Anyways, we've got the features, the feature request about like many times, but for us it would be like a complete rewrite of the app because we're only on these native technologies. So there is no plans at the moment to switch again, but maybe in the future.
One day. One day.
One day.
All right. Do you guys know other tools than other than Insomnia, Poe, or Postman
That's me, but you are the expert.
that you have been using probably before?
I can definitely stress on Insomnia.
Okay.
I think it's a really good one. It doesn't have like all the feature set that Power Postman can have, but it's well designed and convenient, I think. And the founder is a super cool guy too. There have been like always a lot of small testing apps, not so good. There is one tool that I recommend though, is HTTPy. It's a command line tool, so not like exactly a GUI, but you can think of it as a better curl. It has syntax coloration. It's very intuitive. Instead of, if you guys have been using curl, you never know what the syntax is. With HTTPy, you just type in your terminal HTTP post and this URL, and it works actually. It's well made.
Nice. All right.
So HTTPy.
Cool. All right. Let's. Any questions so far on API clients? No. All right. Let's go now on tools for debugging. How do you guys debug your API? Like either in the development mode or mostly in the development mode when you are developing your API.
Okay, so I think we use API client.
Okay.
It's probably the best way to have to test it and to see if it's working or not. Of course, you can debug inside the code to make sure the data is correct, and also to write tests to make sure the tests are. If you are doing test-driven development, then you write your test and then you make sure your API is replying correctly.
All right. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, totally. Like just playing with your API and the client and writing tests, TDD, works well. I would also mention proxying. That's the one thing that I was doing before, actually, in my previous jobs. Just using a proxy client. If you develop a client app and the backend, you want to know what's happening in the middle, and that's not always easy. So I can mention Charles, which is a proxy app, a GUI, and MeetM proxy. It's more of a CLI and like a GUI in the terminal, but it works pretty well too.
All right.
Maybe also the webhooks.
Yeah, that was my next question. How do you guys debug? No problem. How do you guys debug the webhooks? Basically, whenever you have a post request incoming, how do you know it's the good one, or how do you debug this?
Test again, and that's probably the best way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So I think the issue here is you have your webhook won't be called by yourself or your client, but by a third-party service. The one I have in mind is the payment notifications from PayPal. If you implement PayPal, they will call your service to say, "Hey, you got money." You don't want to miss that, probably. It's an interesting information when you run your company. And I can think of there are tools called bins or HTTP bins. They will just give you a URL, and basically they will record everything that's coming to this URL, so you can later check what has been called. And the other solution for that is to actually have a sort of reverse proxy that will expose your local host, your local debug server, when you're running your whatever framework it is. You want to expose this local port to the outside internet. So, like, say, PayPal can call your internal server, and for that there is a small tool called ngrok, N-G-R-O-K, I believe, and it does exactly that. You just run that in your terminal, say that you want to run that on port 8080, and everything that goes to that port will they will give you a URL, and everything will go to your local server.
Has anyone used a bin already, like a request bin or post bin? Raise your hand. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because I've been using Postbin for a while. I know there is request bin as well, HTTP bin as well. I know one of those has been bought by RunScope or something like that. I've been seeing their logo. I think it's HTTP, yeah, or Postbin. I remember, but basically, okay. I always type like bin something on Google and the first request, and I think they're good in SEO, so that's why they end up first now. Okay, cool. Now let's go on API descriptions and doc generations. So, what do you think about the different API description formats in the ecosystem that are available in general?
Okay, I'll take that one first then. Well, I think the three big ones will be, for many years already, are Swagger / OpenAPI. Is their newer name? I think it's the main one today. So OpenAPI version 3, and RAML, and API Blueprint. What can I say on each of them? I don't think I have a favorite, but I would say like Swagger is maybe the most popular, the one that's really taking the lead today. It's also either JSON or YAML based. RAML is actually, I think, quite close to Swagger. It's RAML only. I find it more intuitive than Swagger. And the latest, maybe my little favorite, API Blueprint, and it's Markdown based. So if you want to parse it yourself, it's hopeless. It can be parsed, of course. They have their own parser and they provide that. But it focuses on humans. The idea is you can read your API description as you would be reading a documentation. Of course, they have all the tooling behind. You can convert API Blueprint to Swagger or RAML or anything else, and you can generate documentation. You can have testing and and so on. But instead of editing a JSON yourself, you'll be editing a beautiful Markdown-like format.
So at Strapi we use OpenAPI because it is the most popular and because we didn't find a lot of codes. So we went for it, and we actually have a plugin that you can install in your Strapi project, and it will automatically generate all the documentation, so all the specification, and also the UI with Swagger UI. So it was the most popular. It was also the most wanted by the community, and that was very, very important because we have a lot of feedback from the community, and we do our best to follow their wishes. And we released this in last December. So yeah, OpenAPI with the Swagger.
So
and just Swagger also because it is open source. Because there are also some solutions which are compatible with the OpenAPI, but there are online services, and we really wanted to use something open source. And the Swagger UI is good. The design is okay, but you have a lot of options, so we went for that.
Okay. Yeah, that was literally my question. Why Swagger and not the other one? Okay.
And just another thing. with GraphQL, we don't have to document the API since it's automatically documented through the GraphQL schema.
Okay, nice. How many of you are using Swagger? Yeah, like pretty much a lot of people. Huh?
I'm curious for the two others. Ramel and
Yeah, and Ramel. Okay.
and API Blueprint.
API Blueprint, yeah. No one. All right.
I know this guy over there.
All right. So obviously descriptions talks then about document generation. What's your 2 cents on that? What a documentation description tool must have in terms of feature, in terms of what it should output, etc.
Okay, so I start. Yeah. So of course API endpoint listing, and what is a verb for each action, what are the parameters, and it's good when you can test your API inside the documentation. So now most of the time you have just a try it button, and you can put your credentials, so you are requesting the API as yourself, what is really convenient. So that's pretty much it. And just to talk also about GraphQL, now GitHub has a very, very good documentation for the GraphQL API with GraphQL, sorry, to try the API, and it's very convenient.
Okay.
No, I think you've nailed it. I would just add, maybe that's just me, but be able to generate beautiful documentation out of it. I'm not sure if I'm satisfied with the documentation generation that exists right now, but I think that would be one argument for me.
Because there is always, this dilemma on how much should be generated and how much you can do it by hand, kind of, to make it beautiful. And it's always hard to either configure the tool yourself a little bit to tweak it and to make it not supported then by the version itself, or just use something which you end up having a documentation like everyone else. It's always the dilemma. I have a story with Slate. So Slate is a documentation generator, which I found it really nice because it looks like the Stripe documentation a little bit, and I was really in love with the Stripe documentation, and we made some tweaks on that. But once you make so much changes, it's just not working anymore. But okay, your doc is beautiful, but whenever you want to change something, then you just have to re-go in the code again and again. And so yeah, it's in my opinion, this is where I would say there is not something that is customizable enough, and so that it's beautiful and yours, and automatable enough to not put a lot of time in it. What you think it's true, or is that just me?
No, I think it's very true. I remember I was chatting about that with Romain, who is the API evangelist at Stripe, and he was like he was giving. I remember he was giving a talk about how to build a good community around your API, and I think you're very right about the Stripe documentation being absolutely amazing. But I think for them, it was not a documentation. It was a product on its own. I wouldn't be surprised if they had 2 guys working for 6 months on the documentation only. Mm-hmm. And that's like, I think Stripe can afford that.
Yeah.
Not every startup can afford to spend so much time on that. So I'm still looking for the tool that allows you to have the perfect documentation without investing so much effort.
Right.
I mean, I think all the description texts to actually explain how it works. Yeah, of course you need to write that, but all the UI of your documentation doesn't need to be like your own thing. It can be common. It's actually common to everyone. If you look at the Stripe API documentation, if you know it, this specific UI could be used by 90% of the REST APIs. Just the text is also very good, but that's just technical writing. The UI itself could be probably reused over and over. Absolutely. Yeah. That one. Yep. I have that too. Maybe not. Yeah, maybe you could if we were writing plugins for each framework. You know, like if you had a Node or Express.js plugin or a Django plugin, you just add that, and then your API becomes smart. The other thing I love about their documentation is when they show but more and more companies are doing that after. When they show you the authentication token, it's actually yours. And if you put your mouse over it, they say, okay, this is the token for this company. And that's awesome to me. You just copy paste and it actually works because it's your token. It's just not example token.
Simple things. Yeah. And especially if you have a public API, it's like going to a concert. Your API is a singer on the scene, and your documentation are the speakers, and you have a lot of people in the room, and if the singer is really good, so your API is really good, and the speakers are bad, then the concert will be super bad. So it's totally part of the product, and companies like Stripe, like Algolia, are totally based on selling their APIs. The API is the product, so the documentation is a really important thing. And Shubham, you were talking about auto-generated documentation versus customization, and it's a real fact that it's super handy to have auto-generated documentation. First, because you save a lot of time, but also because it will be automatically maintained in the future. Because as soon as you add an update in your API, it will be added in your documentation instead of waiting for someone in the team to add the new endpoint in the documentation, and you know what it is. So I think it's always good to have something which auto-generates the documentation, but you also have to be able to override some endpoints. So it can be a description, it can be some parameters. And this is for the specifications, so for the Open API specifications, for example. And this is also true for the UI. But I think there are very two different things. For example, in our documentation plugin, we auto-generate the documentation, but you can add files for override if you want to change a description, for example. And then the UI is the Swagger UI, so it's completely independent. So if you want to change the style of the UI, you don't change the specification.
Okay. All right. Is there any favorite API documentation on the market today, like your all-time favorite? For you, yeah. Any
documentation generator?
No. Just any documentation of any API provider that you really like.
Good question. Yeah, Stripe. Stripe is probably the best one. Do you mean what we learned doing this?
Like, is there any things that you see in the Stripe documentation that you love so much that you try to implement on your side?
Okay. Yes, that's a question. Actually, we didn't because we do not have a public API, so it's a little bit different. So. But yeah, for example, for the token, when you're in the backend of Strapi, you can super easily copy the token and paste it in the Swagger UI. But we don't have cookie-based authentication, so we cannot do that like Stripe. But if we could have do that, it would have been great. So yeah, we didn't copy that much, but maybe we should do that a little bit more.
And for you, what is the documentation on the market?
Let's copy Stripe.
Yeah.
Yeah, still in my mind, copy Stripe.
That's funny because I think I've been asking this question for 2 years now, and for more than 2 years, and it's always Stripe, and it's probably you're right, because for them it's a product on their own, you know, like it's a whole thing, and for me the best thing in it is just that you go on it and you have your token already filled, you have your data in the documentation, and this is what makes the beauty of it.
It also ties to who is your customer.
Right.
Is your document just an accessory of your business, or is your documentation the product? If API is the product. If your API is the main product, then your main customer is the developers, and that means the person who will make the decision, the business decision, is likely to be a tech guy. And I think Stripe is the perfect example of such a company.
Right. Yeah. Because usually when companies are not an API-based product, it's always something which is on the side, right? And it is usually the case, because API is only part of the thing. It's one part of the company. Let's say you have an email business or you have a SMS business. I mean, what you're doing is email and SMS. API might be the way to trigger it, you know, but there might be other ways. Let's say, for example, Mailjet or SendGrid, these or Mailchimp, they all have a user interface on where they handle everything, but they have an API as well. So now they have two products, and on the second product, which is the API, they're now going to document it, and obviously they will put less effort than a company which everything is about API, like Stripe. That's yeah. So I would say it's normal that they're the best. All right. Any question on the documentation generation? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think GraphQL is pretty smart about it. You are able to label a parameter as deprecated. I think it depends on whether you want to have a very specific versioning in your API, and then probably you need to have one like you do for a library. You'd have the documentation for each version of it. I think that's one thing. But then maybe that's a tech decision. Do you want your backend to support multiple versions of your API? Again, Stripe is doing that, but who wants to have like multiple versions of the same code running just to support different APIs? You probably don't if you're a small company. So yeah, I think I would still have multiple versions and like maybe a selector when you can switch. That's what I would do. But maybe that's more specific question for you. That was an iPhone.
That's all right.
So yeah, I totally agree. So first of all, don't break your API. It's the best thing to do. And if you have to break it, then bump a new version, and in your documentation you add the select, and yeah, it's much better.
version. That's also a way to implement it. But then you have sometimes to send an email to everybody and say, like, hey, we changed the API, right? Yeah, it's not always the yeah, or Slack is better, or what you can do is like some depending on the how do you manage your API. You also have some messaging in your developer dashboard, so you can implement like a specific email notification about the API changes using the login, the dashboard analytics of the user, the account. Right? So many ways, but there is no better way to measure it. And just put deprecated in red.
Yeah.
It's like red on the documentation after all of this. So this is the best practices most of the time for multi-channels, and try to find the best one for your community.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Mehdi, for that. Yeah, and it's true. Like I have experiences with some documentations that I've been trying to implement something, which were version 2.7, and I was on the version 3.4, and I was not understanding for 1 hour why it was not working. Just before realizing that I was not on the latest thing, and it was just a small link on the bottom with just, hey, go on the latest. I was like, of course. And obviously, whenever, and on the other side, experiencing a major shift of documentation, like from a V1 to a V2, if you change everything and you want to still keep the previous one, you have serious SEO issues. Means that the previous documentation always come up first on the Google searches. So you're just, whenever someone want to Google your API, they end up on the previous documentation. So if you don't put it in big red that, hey, this is not the good one, and if you don't, I would say, respect the best practice of SEO to put redirects and stuff like that, Google will never let your second API, the new API, come up first. So yeah, I think more than that, there is as well how Google is handling that as well. Yeah. 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 Right. As well. Go to the second. It doesn't work. All right. API testing now. So no question on documentation tools now. All right. Let's go on API testing. You were talking about testing just before. How do you how do you do that step? Like, how do you test your API?
Yeah, so it really depends on the language you are using, because there are libraries for each language. We are using Jest with request and supertest, and that's it.
All right. And when should you start this step? Like, should it be since day one, or at which frequency did you add these tests? It's probably testing questions, but
yes, it's a testing question. So yeah, from day one, it's the best, and yeah, of course. But this is not what we did, to be honest, because we had to deliver super quickly. But now we added much more tests to add more stability. So yeah, that's it.
All right.
I think I would say it depends on whether reliability is a serious issue for your product. I think the two examples I would bring is Facebook on the one side and Stripe on the other one. Facebook always had, at least in the early days, the philosophy of breaking things but moving fast, and because they don't really manage sensitive issues. Well, you will say personal data, but I don't think they cared much at the time. On the other side, you have Stripe, which obviously has much more reliability constraints there. That's just a matter of big bucks, I guess. So yeah, I think that's really what you want to think here. Like your payment process, yes, I mean, test it on day one. You don't want to overcharge people or undercharge them. But maybe things that are less important, I would say, maybe you can defer it, because like we always have to ship quickly and move fast. And I also think that investing too much time on testing, if it's not like a crucial thing, may be actually a waste of time, because as a startup you may iterate and just destroy some features. So I think one interesting thing that happens now is some tools are starting to making it possible to test the API from the UI, or at least not write unit tests that we've been doing, what I would be doing too. So I'm thinking of Postman, which is bringing testing features inside the app, so you can just say some small assertions in your API. I want the response code to be 200. These kind of things. So I think it will never replace real unit testing, for many obvious reasons, I think. But for quick and dirty tests, I think it's very efficient. And it's something also we'll be adding to POW.
All right. And what about, so you were talking about some tools. Is there any other tools that you have been using? Isn't there any specific tool that is doing not tests from the UI side, but just doing some periodically requests to your API to some endpoints, and kind of a status page, but only for some specific endpoints, and which will test your entire API and give you how everything's going? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe testing your API in production.
Yeah.
So like sort of a monitoring thing. Yeah, health check.
Yeah.
I think it's super interesting, because then you can have a sort of integration testing and know from all the spectrum. Unit tests will never tell you if your database is broken.
Of course.
But I think the issue with that is you'll never be able to call destructive calls, or it will be very dangerous. Or you need to create something and then destruct it if you want to test everything. So
but you can do that on another environment, which is only a testing environment as well.
It can be there. In my opinion, it will never replace real unit testing.
Yeah.
One thing to do that, and even in production, but I think you will move to that later on, is actually monitor your API and have kind of a proxy in front of your API, like a reverse proxy that logs your API, and maybe have some assertions there. So you don't test that yourself, but you will be alerted if some real customers are hitting on your API and getting a response that they shouldn't be getting.
All right, cool. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about API gateways. So can one of you explain what is an API gateway, and when should we use that one?
Yeah. To be honest, I'm not sure where I would put the limit between an API gateway and an API monitoring tool. But I know gateways are used for large enterprise customers that have a lot of older APIs, maybe SOAP APIs, RPC APIs that they don't want to advertise or are not easy to use, that also have maybe security concerns. They can have no authentication process on their API because it was an internal use API, and they want to start to expose it to either the public or maybe to other sort of one-to-one API to another company. And I think that's where gateways can be interesting. Instead of writing, picture yourself, you are the CTO of a company, and you have a set of APIs that already exists here, a lot of services in your company, and now you are asked to create an interface between your company and the public. So you can either decide to write your own code and have to do everything, or maybe use a gateway that will provide a set of tools for doing that. Yeah, I think it's also interesting for microservices architectures, when you have a lot of services that don't need to be legacy, but you actually want to keep them that way, and just have a gateway that will provide an interface, a clean interface to these things.
Is any one of you using an API gateway? Yeah. All right. Both you. Okay. Yeah, you want to add something?
Yeah, so the API gateway is really the entrance of all your APIs. So it is both the security wall and the repository of all the APIs you have behind it. And it's really good to avoid duplication, because if your API is public or only for your users, you will centralize all the authentication only in the API gateway. So you won't have authentication for each of your services. So it's much better for the security and to avoid duplication. And it can also analyze all of the requests. Kong is really good at that. Traffic also, but it's more a proxy, and it's very good if you are using Docker. So yeah,
AWS. Ouais.
yeah, AWS has also an API gateway, which is good if you are using all the AWS services.
All right. From those of you that are using API gateway, which one are you using? IBM. Okay. Strong Loop. Okay. Axway. Okay. All right. Any questions on API gateways already? No. Now let's come to we talked a little bit before API monitoring, and so let's say I have built my API and I have a set of 20 routes that are all doing separate things and specific things. How do I know that like some routes are called more than the others? How do I know that some are slowest? Like basically, like are there any monitoring ways that are better than the others? Like what do you guys use today?
Cross your fingers and it will be fine. No, so of course you have to monitor your API. It's really important to make sure it's not down. The responses codes are good. So you can monitor at different levels. So if you are using an API gateway, you will have the monitoring at this level. But it's also good to have monitoring at the process level. So if you are using, for example, an Node.js application as an API, you can use monitoring tools like Qmetrics, like Neuralink. So there are a lot of them available on the market. Also, your hosting provider can provide you some monitoring tools. So it also depends on where you are hosting your API.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add. Like, maybe give you my experience. POW is hosted. The cloud services are hosted on AWS, and just the metrics we get from the logs, like gathering together server logs and bringing them together to a log processor, and also the log from the load balancer that gives you the URLs and motifs, has been enough. So yeah. I don't think I would push for like much more of that. But yeah.
Do you analyze each endpoint?
No, like we don't have all metrics specific for each endpoint, but things like latency and stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. And so you told me about the Neuralink and these tools for the monitoring part. Is there like now? Let's talk about the security part. How do we know that everything is going as expected in terms of security? Like, because usually, when we think about security in API, we think about authentication and stuff like that. But usually problems are not where we think they are. Do you have any recommendations about on API security in general?
I don't. I'm actually in the process to find a real pen tester and to actually run that on the infrastructure to actually know what's going on. So, but otherwise, no.
Okay.
Yeah, and to be honest, I never used a specific tool in production for security. But of course, we can talk about Screen, which is very good at that.
Okay. I've used RunScope for the monitoring part, which is quite nice. Is there anyone who uses the API monitoring tool specifically? No. Why? Which one is that? Sentry? Yeah, for and Midi. API Fortress. All right. Hmm. Okay. And Prometheus. Hmm. And Prometheus. Okay. All right. All right. Thanks. Arno, do you have things to add on security? So Arno works at Screen, so he probably knows. But yeah, yeah, that's. Okay.
Can I troll?
Yeah.
We are in Python, so we don't need security.
All right. Let's talk any unclassified tools. Like, is there any tool that you couldn't not use every single week, like a tool specifically on API?
VS Code.
Do you have one coming in mind?
Maybe I can tell you about one tool that I wish I could be using every day. And maybe that's the next iteration for POW, is actually a way to quickly send an API request. Like, I think both POW, Postman, and other clients are too heavy. And when you just need to send one thing, there are so many cases, not to test maybe my API, but like any endpoint. I want like a light thing like curl. You know what I mean? Something where you can just enter one URL, 2 parameters, and go, and not have a full UI, a full thing. So I was thinking, of maybe of a menu bar application on Mac, something that runs on top. You just paste an URL and it says, do you want post, get, whatever. Do you want to add headers? Just something super easy. So maybe that's a call for an open source project.
And HTTP, you talk about the one project.
Yeah, it's what I do, or either HTTP or POW, but that's HTTP is still terminal, so not as nice as a UI.
Okay. Yeah, because whenever it's cool for a GET request, you just put it on a web browser, but whenever you want to do something a little bit parameter-wise or something like that,
or like just a post with a JSON, a URL and a JSON. That's it. That covers already a lot of use cases.
Like probably 80%. Do you have some monitoring on how your users use POW? Like, what are the features that they use the most?
No, in the early days, I put some Google Analytics.
Okay.
So I have a bit of analytics, and in the end, I just realized that there was all this issue of when do you ask prompt for permission for adding analytics, and in the end, I was just not comfortable having analytics on the native apps. It's very acceptable on, I would say, mobile apps and a web. I don't know why, but on the native app, it just didn't sound right for me.
For users. All right.
Yeah.
All right, guys. This is the end. We're just gonna finish with some closing words because the pizzas are here as well. Can you both tell me what are the latest kind of news or new project that you're working on? Begin with Strappy.
So internally,
yeah.
So we are working on new plugins that we are going to publish in the next few months to add more features in the CMS. But we are mostly working on the architecture itself of Strappy. So it's quite a complicated project because we have a really important plugin system, and we are currently working on that to make the ecosystem really scalable with a plugin which can add features both in the admin panel and API endpoints. So this is what we are really working on.
Okay.
They'll be shorter, GraphQL.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. What are, I would say, on the API scene, is there anyone who is inspiring you more, any other than Stripe?
To me, one guy, I always forget his name because he's Czech. He's Zdenek Nemek, I think. He's the creator of API Blueprint. First, I love the two products he's created. API Blueprint, I think it's a beautiful one, and also created Apiary that was they've been acquired by Oracle, but I really liked what they were doing. I stopped following them, and now he's writing. He started his own consultancy company, and he's still writing blog articles. And like every time I hear talks from him or read article, is always inspiring me.
All right.
His blog is good API.
Nice. Do you have something to add? No? All right. So thank you for a big round of applause for our guests, because they have been given everything.